Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us on day two of the Electronics Lifecycle and Supply Chain Summit. We are opening with one of the more interesting topics that we've selected for this particular uh, conference, and also it's a topic that's of course on everybody's mind: artificial intelligence. But we're approaching this from a different angle. We're looking at the implications for the electronic supply chain. Of course, you have the AI supply chain itself, and then you have the impact of AI itself on the electronic supply chain. We're going to be exploring all of these with our guests from Generative AI Nerds and Talking IoT, Steve Kerr and Kerry Shee. Before we start, hello, Steve. Hello, Kerry. Great again to have you on board. Just some housekeeping. My name is Bolaji Ojo, publisher and managing editor of the Ojo Yoshida Report. I want to welcome you again. If you have a question for our presenters, please click the Q&A button in the upper right corner of your screen and type your question into the window. We will try to answer your questions live, as many of them as possible. Others may be answered with a chat response. Now, secondly, all our presentations are being recorded and they will be available after the live session. So the topic for this particular session is the AI supply chain. So we are going to be exploring the transformative role that we expect generative AI will play in supply chain management, its applications in things like demand forecasting, inventory optimization, predictive maintenance, and sustainability. I'm going to add one element, which is the supply chain that supports AI itself. I think both Steve and Kerry are basically best positioned to address these. So again, joining me are Carrie Shea. He is the founder and CEO at Generative AI, Gen AI Nerds. And of course, Steve Kerr, founder of Talking IoT. My very long startup, okay? So I'm going to now shut up. And Steve and Carrie, over to you.
No worries, Balaji. Thank you very much. Actually, I want to start on a point that you made about the supply chain in the electronics industry and get Kerry's input on some of this. I mean, clearly, Balaji, I met you at Electronica earlier on this year, which is always a great event. But actually, the sentiment there was kind of mixed, right? We came out of 2022 to into 2023, 2024, and we've gone through this market of allocation and then a market of too much product and not enough orders because the product is still being cycles. We know some of that was generated from things such as COVID-19, Ukraine, and also in today some of the geopolitical issues that we've got. But if we'd had AI at that point or generative at that point, would that have assisted us? Would that have reduced some of that? And will that actually enable us to smooth that stuff going forward? And at that point, I'm going to throw that kind of question a little bit towards Kerry being the expert and, if you like, the AI father in the Gen AI Nerds kind of scenario.
Oh, wow. That definitely makes me feel older. I do have kids, but I never been called a father. If he's a grandfather, I'd have to come across the conference call. I think that, excuse me, I think number one, if generative AI has had so much pull through demand that, demand revenue cures all problems and all things in business, right? So I think if you had the demand side of what generative AI could do for chips, NVIDIA's stock price, ChatGPT, all this, many tens of billions of dollars from Silicon Valley investors, like all that stuff would have helped for sure. I think from a supply chain perspective, you have so many benefits that generative AI could streamline, optimize, and make more intelligent. But I think what I've seen from it is just a very stodgy ability to navigate very big ships, right? I mean, these are quite literally big ships, like bringing ships around, but like these companies move so slowly. So they'll actively talk about, well, in 2 years we'll be okay. It's like no other business thinks, well, in 2 years we'll turn the curve of our business around. And I think investing in things like generative AI to give every facet of the supply chain more intelligence and more agility would be an easy place to start. But I hate to like say, generative AI solves all problems when I do recognize that supply chain itself is like vastly complicated, and the readiness of the data to assist, the readiness of like subject matter experts and all that stuff to sit down and help a generative AI expert, as it were. It's not a one meeting sort of thing and then you pilot. I think it sort of brings up dozens of problems that are just at the core of the business itself and supply chain. So
I wonder though, Kerry, the way you describe these, I mean, you're saying that the industry has certain ways by which it operates and certain beliefs. This acceptance of abnormality as normal. It seems to me that is that not something that maybe we need to have a change of mind also in how we operate. We can't just take these tools and say we're just going to use it if we don't change the way we perceive things in the supply chain. Should we accept abnormalities of inventory overload and shortages, going round and round like this?
Well, I think the last conversation I was a part of was sort of what's going around the industry. I forget who coined it, but you're not going to lose your job to generative AI itself. You're just going to lose your job to someone who uses generative AI to be more productive, more effective, more intelligent than you could possibly be, right? It's like the superhuman power. So scale that out to a company level. I mean, in my lifetime, we saw Southwest upend all the other airline carriers. It's now itself a dated old company, loaded with bureaucracy. But when it started, it had more streamlined operations for something that was very complicated, right? So it's a facsimile for supply chain. And you see something like Southwest just completely kicked the butt off of everyone, from price to just like logical, rethinking all sorts of ways that you fly, right? So I think a new supply chain companies or groups that are in the middle and kind of down the chain of how products move will pick these things up faster. So yeah, I think it's high time that you should be thinking about how these technologies streamline everything from the design point of view to process optimization to the actual parts, like physically defects. So really, you're going to see it in all the tools that you're using anyways, whether you like it or not. But yeah, so I think the question is, these things are probably already being presented to you. Are you denying them, or are you waiting for upgrades to tools and platforms that help you today? Those are kind of easy wins, I would think, to start saying, okay, vendors, I already trust you to do the CAD work for this, or I trust you to make the systems that move boxes from left to right. Like every part of your supply chain has lots and lots of vendors, and they're all looking at or building in generative AI into theirs. So I think the easy win is to start being an active listener to what they have to offer and see how that can map in. And then you're going to need some talent inside your own organization to help understand how that works. I'm not saying just buy every upgrade for every vendor you're using, but there definitely needs to be a strategy in place. And I think it all comes back to what is the impact this can have, not from like a high level verb perspective, but like what are some of our biggest challenges right now, and can this help? That's a good place to start.
But isn't that down to, and just summarizing actually, Carrie, I think what you were saying there, it's not what will AI do to me, it's what will AI do for me, which is one way of looking at it. But actually, Balaji, one of the things that you mentioned, one of the things that I hear a lot is what people really want from the supply chain is that degree of stability and predictability. So how do we get stability and predictability and get out of those cycles, right? To your point about, is it acceptable to have those cycles? I'm not going to say how many years I've been in the electronics industry. It will show my age, and it's many. And I've seen plenty of those up-down cycles. But actually, I think the last cycle that we had a degree of extremity to it because of some of the events I mentioned before. You had the COVID issue. You then had Ukraine, which had impacts in terms of the semiconductor market, in terms of some of the base materials. You had that impact on the automotive market at the same time. None of those are predictable, but I don't think that we're very well positioned to crunch data with the what if type scenarios. I also don't think, by the way, there's enough data out there at the moment to make valuable what if statements, even using generative AI, because you are dependent on that data structure being there and the history of that data structure being there. You've got seasonality, right? You know, if you took the first 6 months of a year and said, okay, I'm going to use that to teach a model, well, we all know that the back end of the year looks very different to the front end of the year. So we do need a set of data. So it's kind of going back a bit to Kerry's point, which is organizations, one, they need to be willing to adapt, but secondly, they also need to look at the resource they've got. Can that resource adapt? Is it the right resource? And also, do they actually have the data structures in place, and are they thinking about those data structures today? And you know, the big problem that we're going to see time after time is the data sets that we want to teach these models on, right? And it's a very fragmented supply chain. We have a really fragmented supply chain, you know, from the manufacturers. Actually, let's not even the manufacturers of components. We can go all the way down to the fabs, all the way through. So it is quite complicated, and it's going to require a degree of, I guess, acceptance, communication, collaboration in order to work that supply chain through in a really effective manner.
Well, I think that I think it starts with if you break down the front end of these supply chains are sort of customer buyer liar problem, right? So the whole system's designed for a customer to come in, meet sales rep. Sales rep says, how many parts do you need? And there's no incentive for the customer to say 2 because you're not going to get any attention. So you say 2 million so that the sales rep gets excited and then resources come to bear. Because like I've gone through this process several times and I was just shocked, which is I've got a product. Yeah, I think it's going to be the hottest product that's ever been made. 20 million. Oh, cool. The answer is it's a penny for this transistor. It's a nickel for this MCU. It's a buck for this, you know, whatever. Cool. Can you also quote it at 2,000? You know, so it's, and then so there's this game that's played, and so they're dealing with the curve of what we call the buyer liar problem, right? So like, you know, you're basically overestimating, and it's not. I guess liars maybe a little bit overkill, but you get the point. It's like, yeah, at the upper dream part of our estimation, it's here. So then, what do they tell their boss, the sales rep, when it's time to like fill in how many we need to create? So you have 100 reps all dealing with this just, you know, wild ass guess of what the customers want, and you end up having like bad data in, bad data out. That's just the start of the problem, right? Then it goes into systems that are jacked up. I mean, they just don't. It's like you said, it's pretty complicated. But what if I told you that the buyer liar problem actually has been solved by one company? I'm sure they'd like me to say their name. But instead of like having to lie to get the attention, to get the spreadsheet over to them that here's the bill of materials for the thing I want built, then a human takes 2 or 3 weeks to look through it and say, yeah, I know what that part is. Oh, wait, what is this part? And then give me your design. And like, it's a full multi-week thing just for them to give you answers for you to decide whether they can even do the job, they want to do the job, all that sort of stuff, right? So then you're doing it across five different companies that could make something for you. This is the front end of the problem. So a new company came out, or evolved, I should say, where we skipped all that and we plugged it in online. We uploaded the spreadsheet. We have not talked to anyone so far in the process. It loaded it all. I'm absolutely sure there was some AI involved, generative or not. Plugged it in and said, yes, we have this part, blah, 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 blah. You plugged in how many. It was effectively a re-engineered, thought-through spreadsheet. You plugged it all in and said, we don't have this part, but we can get it from DigiKey. We can get it from Mauser. We can get it from, you know, all this stuff. And you were dropping it down. But already immediately, 80% of the line items on our bill of materials, we had like the answer. Oh, what happens if we bump it up to 1,000, 2,000, 10,000, 20,000? And it was just in line. So we're just doing our own research. Haven't met anyone yet, okay? By the time you get through the cart, they're like, would you like us to build this? It would be, you know, $100 a unit for this, plus taxes, plus tariffs, plus whatever. Not only did we go from 3 weeks to just talk through our spreadsheet before another 3 weeks before we got a first pass with the salesperson trying to do the dance and shuffle with us. We went from like a day to where it was all concrete information for us. By the time we pulled the trigger, it arrived in 22 business days, and we had done this like the beginning of this year, right before Chinese New Year. Like it actually it arrived faster than it would have took someone else to quote it, is my point. And this exists today. And that's lightly AI, but just it's more about companies being thoughtful about what is stopping good data coming in and like more people wanting to go. Every entrepreneur I've talked to, I was like, go to the site. Even if you don't work with them, it gives you a baseline. And we did not talk to anyone there. And we had our failure out of the box failure rate was better than local CMs we've used. Completely friction-free model, in my opinion. So, long-winded story.
Sorry,
that's the future is people thinking through those experiences.
I wanted to follow up on that. The entire process that you described just now, was it anonymous from the beginning? Because maybe that eliminates the need to go through these buyer-liar problem scenario.
You think it's anonymous? I mean, you set up an account, but I think the word we haven't used that will, like with every generation, I think as we're older, we're kind of like, this data is really special to me. At scale, no one cares. These vendors aren't behooved to sit there and say, oh my God, you're putting this transistor with this MCU. You must have magical intellectual property, right? Like by the time you're asking someone to build a unit of something, it is just X's and O's. And the fact that there's 4 humans in the loop that are manually reading it, I would argue is actually more problematic. I trust a company who has thought through a process so much that they've removed all the friction for me to like get to what I want. So I think that word for me is transparency. So like the more information I'm giving, the better job they can do. You're transparent by sending everything to these companies now. It's just that some poor humans got to slog through 560 items on your bill of materials to do all this stuff. And it lightly impacts like the pipeline reports and everything that they use on the back end to decide. But I mean, imagine what their pipeline report looks like. It looks closer to a T-shirt shipping company who's like, how many T-shirts did you print? And what stamp do I have to put? By the way, Jenny Einer's shirt. Got this in 48 hours, same thing. Go on a website, plug my icon on, it's going to be like that, right? Like it's perfect information. By the way, when I've worked with other contract manufacturers and the electronic supply chain, after the bill of materials, there's all these other conversations that have to happen because they don't have like a digital handle on everything that I've sent them. It is like a zip file of stuff that they keep cracking open, and there's versioning problems and all that stuff. So all I'm saying is that your lunch is going to get eaten by companies who figure these things out faster. If you're wondering why your sales pipeline is less, if you're wondering like all these things, it's all happening because you're not thinking through these workflows, or if maybe you all have thought through it, but you just don't have the inertia within your organization to change it and make it better. So I think when you add generative AI's underlying intelligence underneath it to answer questions and to like scale your, I'm sure, waning budgets and waning human capacities to help do these things, this is the sort of thing I'm talking about. But it does take like a subject matter expert and motivation to apply it.
I think that buyer-liar thing's kind of interesting because having been around the sector for a long time, it's actually probably slightly worse than Kerry's identified. It's not about the guy that says, yeah, 2,000, that's going to quote me for 2 million. If you think about the channels that supply the products, you think about how many of those salespeople are talking to the same customer. How often does that same opportunity end up backing to an organization for quoting, and what impact does it then have on the supply chain kind of going forward? So it's extrapolated by probably 10x. One person over quoting, you've got that scenario which is going through, which is why we see design funnels with relatively low conversion ratios, right? For exactly the reason Kerry's just identified. I guess one of my questions and thoughts is, does the data that we've got historically help improve that buyer-liar scenario, which ultimately improves the supply chains? Or do we see a situation where that traditional sales process is somewhat more removed to the process that Kerry's described, right? Where people are actually removing the need for that interaction with somebody banging on the door asking what they want. and actually putting that straight into a system. That being the case, you're going to get a much higher degree of accuracy in terms of the demand forecasts. And we saw, we're coming, hopefully we're coming out of, but we saw 2024 being that year of oversupply. And why did that happen? Companies ordered 2-3x what they needed during allocation because they weren't. And then eventually, when the channels got the products, quite rightly, they shipped the products to the customer. The customer's now sitting on 9-12 months worth of inventory, and there's no manufacturing taking place or limited manufacturing taking place further down the supply chain. And that's almost, forget the geopolitical, the Ukraine scenario, COVID scenario. We create that problem every year. We create that problem in both an up market and a down market. And that moving that using generative AI or an element of AI in the format that Kerry was mentioning clearly is going to improve everything in the supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, my buddy is he's the COO of an aerospace company, and their supply chain is vastly complicated because they're shipping rockets, So I think, but I mean, I was talking to him over beers. I was like, that you could almost just drop a private generative AI fabric and run a RAG application, which basically means it's like all local knowledge. It's not using open AI and ChatGPT and all that sort of stuff, and basically be asking these higher level questions that, if not instantly answerable, are something that just digitally goes off and tries to figure it out. So things like match the contracts to the SKUs I bought and look at the terminations and when the windows have cost changes. And then, so those are like easy wins where you have like sort of documents you forgot about. There's 10,000 items in there, and we found 6 whose contracts governance is out. What does that mean? The sales rep's going to hit you for a cost increase. Like there's just all these things that are floating around executives' brains that are bothersome, but not individually worth solve. Like, I wish I knew that. Oh, I wish I knew that. I wish I could add. And a lot of the answer does come to generative AI, where it can be basically correlating and answering these things in the way you would task a human to do it if you had folders of paperwork and enough time to do so. So I think it's hard to answer something where the dynamic is, I'm very worried you're not going to have anything, so I'm going to buy 2 million because I'm Amazon and I want to sell 50 million Echoes this month, right? Like, I think I don't want to say that generative AI solves that, because I think some of that is just a market-driven problem. There's every incentive in the world for the selling side be like, oh, you got to put an order on file for me to even go tell you what the lead time is, right? I mean, the other buyer liar problem is like the supplier liar thing. I just coined that. The sales reps going, the lead time is 52 weeks. The lead time's always 52 weeks, Jane. No matter what I ask, it's 52 weeks. Well, you put an order in, the answer is 2 weeks. So again, it's just it's like the little games that are played. Right. And a lot of it is just, it's at the interaction point between, the money, right? The buying side and the selling side. And so I think it's vastly complicated, but I think looking at how those interactions take place and streamlining that makes it better for all players. And I think once one player makes it better, like the company I mentioned that allows you to make a whole unit without ever talking to someone. I mean, that's not the goal, but it was just like this friction-free thing. What's the friction-free version of me, a trusted buyer? I buy tons of stuff from you. Give me access to your damn database. Just let me, give me a subsection of the stuff and let me do my own. Then you just saved all the phone calls. You saved all the back and forth. So I think as soon as companies start opening those, then I think we can see some advancement.
Let me ask you though, the very elements of what constitutes buyer liar problem or supplier liar problem. I think there are various elements of why people engage in that exercise, and it's not just about pricing. So it comes down to trust as an issue. So can we do a dive into what are the factors that constitute this buyer liar, even supplier liar problem? Why do people get engaged in it, and what are they trying to achieve?
Well, I think the buyer liar problem exists because the supplier side doesn't give enough transparent information. It's not rocket science, and these are chips. So why don't you just tell me that that 1 unit is $1 and 1,000 units is a penny? Just tell me. Like, I don't know why you're hiding it. Then it encourages the buyer liar side problem. The supplier side, the supplier liar lead time issue is there for exactly the same reason, is to motivate the buyers to. So like the buyers are like shaking their head going, you're ridiculous for not just like putting it out there on the internet. And the supplier side is like these I get a lead, which is some like person who's signed up and then wants to know pricing right away. And so they're trying to extract more information and do their sales job. So that part's understandable as well. But I think it comes from like a fear that that you'll be able to cross compare too readily. There's nothing more commoditized than the electronic supply chain market. Like, can you move your brain past that? Because there's no one I trust more. Or let's look at Amazon for a second. Okay. Is there any more transparency or trust from there? Like, I'm sure there's lots of reasons to hate them, and just period, for how big they are and monopolistic they are. Is there any vendor you trust more that if you bought it, you're sure you'll be able to return it? Is there anyone else that, like, when you press that buy button, that you understand 100% what's going to happen, and it's going to happen at 98% likeliness? If you go to Alibaba, it's like the opposite experience. So which one do you want to be? Like, you build systems and processes that build trust. The more I have to talk to someone over WhatsApp on a thing on my phone to, like, it's like all of that builds distrust in my mind. And the younger, if you polled younger generations, right, they'd rather buy something over text message than talk on a phone, right? So I think, again, it's the systems and workflows thing again. And I think if you have thought through something well and the back engine of the interaction works as expected, nothing builds trust in the digital era as much as that.
But you have the relationship challenge there, because effectively you're now taking away relationships, right? Because that trust element's coming from a process, which I agree, right? I mean, if you take the Amazon process, of course, you trust it. You know what you're going to get. If you go on to Prime, whatever, it's going to ship the next day. It does what it said. It delivers customer satisfaction.
Right.
So I do think there's the element of how do you ensure that the supply chain is delivering that level of customer satisfaction. It's so fragmented within the sector, and there are so many different vested interests, if you like, from the various parties that are part of it, that when you talk, Balaji, to your first question, well, how do you stop that buyer liar type scenario, or how does it end up getting generated? It's because, my personal opinion, there's fear. If I'm company A and company B is trying to take my business, there's an element of fear. You have the element of natural competition that's going on. And at the end, the only person that becomes dissatisfied can be the end customer. So the transparency of the data removes that out. So when you talk about processes, and Kerry used Amazon as an example, by removing, if you like, those points of potential error or buyer liar type scenarios, the supply chain becomes much more simplified. What does that mean in a period of potential shortage? Well, it means actually those parts are likely to be spread. People aren't going to feel quite the pain that they felt before. Probably not also going to feel the price increases the way they felt them at the same time either, right? Because, there's an artificial element of demand. If somebody comes in and buys everything you've got available, you might want to sell it on. I mean, Electronica this year had more sourcing companies exhibiting than I've ever seen before. Guys buying excess inventories or going out and buying products during periods of shortage and marking them up and selling them at higher prices. There's a market for that, and that's absolutely fine, that they're doing a job. But the transparency, if we could get that transparency right in the first place, if we can get the data sets right in the first place, if there is accuracy in terms of the forecasting all the way down that chain, then we're not going to have the depth of problems that we've seen over the last couple of years, for sure. But it does come down to data, and data is going to be the inherent problem that we're going to come across. The sharing of data, how do we train those models on the data? Everybody's got their own kind of interest. I have a view, generative AI can help massively, even in the status quo as we see it today.
Right.
but it needs to build up that historical data set over a period of time. It's not going to fix that in the next 6, 9, 12, 18 months. It's going to need a longer period unless historical data is made available. Right?
Yeah.
If you think of things like generic supply chain, switching away slightly from the electronics, and people look at, well, how's that being benefit? I was talking to Kerry just before the call. Carbon Trust made a note that $30 billion a year are wasted on pharmaceuticals. They've actually got sensors on them. They're measuring the temperatures on them, but these things end up getting routed the wrong way, or something happens in the world. Shipments get delayed, product gets spoiled. It's $30 billion worth of pharmaceuticals and drugs that are actually coming in. So that's huge, right? In terms of stuff that doesn't happen. And how do you overcome that? Well, that comes down to the what if. So in those types of instances, I see generative AI being able to almost sit as an overlay. So it almost becomes part of your logistics partner. What if? How do I reroute that really quickly? What's happening in the world today geopolitically? What's happening in certain areas? Is there a risk associated to going up the Suez Canal because it's blocked because a tanker's turned in it? If so, what's the fastest route I can take and how quickly can I take it? In the example I give in terms of the perishable stuff, that's critical, right? That $30 billion might be a third saved, 2/3 saved. Don't know, but there is the element that you could implement that type of solution.
I mean, when you say it, I feel like the biggest concern, like the biggest thing that prevents all this from moving forward, I think, is the cross section of how motivated are you to solve that? How economically motivated? So not soft ROI. You just mentioned something that's a pretty hard ROI, right? And that there's a very low batting average for successful technology projects impacting real ROI, right? Let's just face it. Like between the implementation or maybe the tech isn't baked enough or whatever, like it's hard to have the cross section where a pilot moves into something meaningful that then gets a pat on the back for the CIO, right? It's just they're fairly rare and people are gun shy. I think to your point, generative AI on the documents is the easiest win. You have documents that affect contracts. You have documents that affect timing. You have documents that are like the compliance about the drug temperature, all that stuff. Start by having generative AI privately digest those documents so that you can have questions answered. You're not plugging it in live. You're not Terminator 2 having it move the drugs for you, right? But there's so many strategic questions that become like these pivotal real-time things you need to know, that by putting that, just creating a pool of all the crucial documents that affect your supply chain and having a RAG private large language model be at the helm ready to answer questions for you. It's just such an easy win. And it'll fuel the appetite for like that. What I just mentioned is a very like low cost implementation, by the way. It's pretty like you can have consulting groups or find someone from our GenAI Nerds community can help you build that out. Super private, super whatever. You could have one user, you could have 3 users. Like that's an easy win, and it'll whet the appetite for saying, cool, like what else can it correlate? We just got done working on a project where we had the easiest win was to let people, because the people that have the appetite wet, they start thinking in prompts. So they ask questions prompt-like. And so we used a new library that's out there that converts prompts to SQL queries. So they want to know, like, what are the vendors with the most expensive whatever with line items that expire in the next 2 weeks, which is that's like a wonky open-ended question. You could have like a linear interface that could do SQL, but it converts the prompt to SQL. And guess what the prompt is for the large language model? Here's the table definition. Here's the underlying table. It's a number, it's a float, it's a string, it's a number, it's a float, it's a date. So we gave it that like 2 tables and how they interacted and what all the data was. And we said, convert this prompt into SQL. So we made multiple passes at it. And now it's answering all this with just completely kind of linear data sets you already have. So again, like I just want to give some like specific applications. So we're not saying generative AI solves all things, but documents, easy win. Connect these things to your traditional databases just from like being able to answer those tricky questions that your boss has or like real-time operational things. It's really cool, like just very practical, I would say.
I'm sorry. One of the things that you guys talked about the last time we talked was that you have to start with an understanding of what generative AI is and
Sure.
how you're going to use it. And the surprising thing, even with this last statement that you talked about, is how many people don't even get that. They don't know exactly what it is. They don't know how to apply it. And it comes down to, like you said, specific applications, specific situations. It doesn't even come to the issue of trust. It just comes to simply even knowing and identifying what AI is and how you can use it within the enterprise.
It's interesting as well, that Balaji, and I'll let Kerry comment on it as well. But we're moving into, I guess, what I would term an agentic world. I mean, 2025. If you read out there, everyone will talk about the agentic world. Creation of lots of different AI agents to do tasks with guardrails on them inside of organizations. But actually, to your point, when I speak to quite a number of senior individuals inside the sector, if you ask if they have an AI strategy, you'll kind of get, yeah, we're thinking about our AI strategy, but not many of them have an AI strategy. And I don't want to put words into Kerry's mouth, but from what he was saying before, which I think I completely align with, is actually in many instances you can start simple, right? You can have that kind of consultation. Start simple. Don't try to, I use the term, boil the ocean. You don't need to boil the ocean. Start somewhere. Mm-hmm. And when you start somewhere simple, you might need to bring in some expertise for a period of time. You might need to train your people up. We talk about different roles, like, you'll hear the term, which is coined quite often, prompt engineering. So college kids growing up today will end up probably being within that area. There'll be job roles for people that are prompt engineers, but it's actually how do you peel the onion? How do you actually communicate the problem that you're trying to solve? And then how do you structure it? So that kind of structured thinking becomes a key element. And companies can start thinking about those simple processes today, and it will improve everything they do. And by the way, by default, that will improve the supply chain. Because just think about that. There are 10,000 components available. There are 10,000 controllers available at company X, but it takes me 2 weeks in order to process the paperwork to get those. In the meantime, company Y has gone in, and their process only took a week. I've now lost those 10,000 pieces. So I've just probably screwed my end customer, and I've got a load of problems now to deal with, right? That stuff should be an easy win. That should be process orientated and be an easy win.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it doesn't take much for these projects to just get denied. Like, let's be honest about the AI moniker, how exhausting it is, how it's, you guys went to electronica, like everyone is AI because it's like, when cloud came out, you couldn't stop talking about cloud and like serverless compute. And there's always like a 1-year moniker that everyone is sort of forced to talk to and address. And like AI has been like vastly underwhelming in its pragmatic value, right? If you asking a CIO what your plans for AI is just like the worst question, because it's at the crosshairs of like, I'm sure there's value there, but like the idea that just by category, I'm going to ask for money for AI runs up against, oh, really, Carrie? Against all this, like the last 10 pilots you ran that were just hit the cover off the ball. The ROI was dramatic, and I loved everything you brought, Carrie. Like it's just everyone has got a little bit of like I don't know how I'm going to pull that off, right? Sort of thing. But much like everything, once the kind of shine pulls off, I'm seeing the smartest marketers just leverage it and shut up about it. Not talking about AI formally, but just talking about their new version, having these superpowers where you're just more subtle with it. Like the new search feature is going to knock your socks off, right? Like Google Drive, when I search through documents, is scary how good Google Drive, like through Gemini now, right? They're talking about Gemini because Google's, they're not phenomenal marketers. I'm just saying when you're in Salesforce, you're going to be using things that are AI powered. They don't need to flex about it. So I think if you're in the world like we are, where we're talking about AI, we don't need to over talk about it. Like, what's that project and what's your plans and all that stuff? Like, it still needs to be, what are the problems? And then the way they get solved happens to be AI. I think generative AI has the heft of being differentiated. I wish it wasn't generative artificial intelligence. I wish it was just something like else that didn't carry the AI part because of everything I'm talking about. Like, it's not a value added word to be using in any part of the conversation per se, because everyone's just like somewhere between rolling their eyes, exhaustion, and like it sounds more it sounds more risky to like pilot such a thing against these other like kind of obvious, albeit boring, like obvious technological things that we're going to try. So I don't know how that gets solved other than like clearing the table and say, here are the problems you want to solve. And generative AI has a unique capacity to solve these outside of what you've heard of AI before, which has been a lot of like cameras and a lot of like detecting things. And outside of that, like people don't know how to apply it.
I think it's about how do you, and we talk about it a lot, but it's the productivity gains that you can get. And actually, to the purpose of depth, what are the simple problems that you're trying to solve? We can enhance your productivity there. You don't necessarily need to mention AI. Effectively, you are using Gen AI to do it. But the reality of it is you can enhance productivity. You can enhance what they're doing in that scenario. And equally, you've also got to remember, if we look at supply chain, really what's happening in there? Well, you've got more and more digitalization coming into the supply chain. You've got more and more sensors in the supply chain producing more and more data. It's getting you into the AIoT type of environment, and that's also quite critical. But you've also got you've got the sustainable circular type arguments coming out as well, where how do we the ESG side of stuff? There's so much carbon, there's so much of this. How do we measure the carbon? Right? You can use the combination of AIoT within that kind of scenario. What do we do with the circular economy in terms of sustainability? Clearly, these technologies have a part to play in terms of helping solve some of those problems, right? So that comes down to how you look at solving them with those areas. So I would, I think people are a little bit hype drunk in terms of the terminology, but I am going to be one of these people that says I don't think it's overhyped. I think it's underhyped in terms of its capabilities and what's coming. But actually, it goes back down to what we saw maybe in the early days of the IoT space. You've got a group of people that are talking internally, the AI language, everything else. What we need to do is talk to the problems people are trying to solve and actually address those.
Carrie, you've got a question from the audience. I think it wraps around the whole issue of trust. I don't know if you can see it on your screen. It's kind of a long question. I wonder if you could just kind of take a look at it.
Yeah, I was just reading it. It's a very good question. I think the gist is that, like, in some senses, this is not dramatically new technology. Let's debate that later. But the idea that, like, I think there's a data in, data out problem with everything that is vastly complicated, and supply chain is probably at the top of the mind of something that is complicated. Imagine like SAP integration. It would be a thankless multi-year effort, I think. The idea is that, like, transparency and the holding on to data, like, is stopping the evolution of this stuff rolling out. My microphone's being picked up by someone else. And I think that the way to break through it, or the way it does break through, is that the individual role that you play, whether you're a customer willing to divulge more information or the front of the supply chain willing to offer more of your pricing and your other, like the supplier liar, buyer liar dynamic, everyone else are service providers to the other divisions. So if you're the group that has to, like, track the inventory and go source all the parts, what are you hiding? Like, why? So I get it. There's like politics and other stuff, but from the top down, there has to be a decision that the group that removes the most amount of friction from the supply chain, it wins at every part of the pat on the back. If you can source product better for the rest of the divisions that you're working for, pat on the back. If you're working with customers and can more transparently and with less friction deliver the price points of the chips and everything that you're offering, that's a pat on the back for you. So it doesn't have to be wall-to-wall instantly open data. It's just like the little bridge points between the questions being asked and what you're being asked to deliver. Don't know why you're holding on to it so strongly. And again, my point is that, like, imagine something where like so much friction is removed that like literally I can't imagine talking to a CM in the same way anymore. Like I just would, even if I do want it because they're local or I don't know, whatever, I still would start with the company I mentioned because it just gives me like a baseline, hard to imagine it's not the best, but at least a baseline answer. Now imagine that at every division and think through, you are a service provider to these other people. Yes, they work for the same company, but you're kind of like need to keep them happy too, right? So how much of that is frictions created by people holding on to data, or the data's like needs to be polished or whatever? I get all the real world frictions, but I don't think of it as like someone's got to declare all the data is open and it's a field day. I just think it's, look, you're giving that data out anyway. You don't want it on the open internet. Like a lot of those mentalities are losing mentalities at scale in the digital world. Like there's very little about the digital world now that isn't about delivering data faster to people who you're trying to extract money or pats on the back from. So I think that's the individual decision.
It's really difficult to do, Carrie and Steve, to actually scale that wall. I mean, you do realize that, if you can remove all of those hurdles that you identify, maybe things get better. But you're so used to doing things in a certain way that it's the same problem companies have at times where they just know that this is the way they've always done things and it's always worked for them and all that. So and then you just don't make the efforts to identify newer ways of doing things. I mean, how do you overcome that mentality?
But actually, Balaji, one of the things that Kerry said, and I'm going to go into the success of Amazon. People love it or hate it, right? It's moment. But in terms of the divisions that they had, there was that moment when every division was told that they had to have and use a standard API process in order to allow everything happening in their division to flow seamlessly through to the other divisions, right? Because there was some challenges, and they were missing milestones. They were missing lots of other developments. And so they did that. They shared that data, and then all of a sudden, you look at the mammoth beast that it is today, right? So there is an element of don't be afraid. The data's coming out anyway. You can still do it within guardrails. You can still do it inside your own environment. You can have a whole different conversation with Kerry about cloud and edge and everything else, right? Which is going on. So the security element of it, I would say, people shouldn't be fearful of. But I do think you have to start somewhere. And rather than being fearful or thinking, I can't eat the elephant. Well, you can, but you just got to take it, one bite at a time. And it's time to take a bite and then kind of go forward. So pick the stuff that you can do, prove that productivity gain, right? Look at documentation, look at standard processes, all of those things. They can be improved straight away. Exactly what we saw with the Bezos model at Amazon when they were going through that massive growth spurt.
Yeah.
Well, sorry, Kerry, I thought you wanted to add to what Steve said.
Yeah, I think that I think the rewards are pretty obvious, and I don't think it's going to take a lot to topple. Let's put it this way: I don't think it's going to be. I think it'll be very obvious the companies that don't evolve these processes division by division, because as a microcosm, like I'm not talking to any CMs anymore. And everyone I know and I talk to, I tell about this new process that's out there. You'd be crazy to think that the owner of the process for their competitors isn't quickly building that as well, right? So just the domino falls. And so maybe the motivation has to come from literally the top because your bacon's being eaten, right? It's markets. That's great. That's great, right? But I do think it's like you have to make these little changes about like the transparency data problem, and like, why are you holding on to that so strongly? And what happens if you do the opposite? What happens if you're generous with the information? Because like it solves all problems. Like if you have more people willing to give you the information and you're trading them for the price quotes and you're doing like all that stuff, all that does is increase your pipeline. Which is like, ask your marketing how costly it is to increase your pipeline, right? Like so you have this like weird world where like by actually making your supply chain better, you make your money-making machine better in the process. And so I'm not saying it's easy, but I think that these tools now give you a path to like answers like both strategic and tactical things that I'm sure are daily problems and questions. I think that's the exciting part.
Excellent. I like the part that you said, be generous with information. I really do love that. But even as I was admitting that to myself, as we wrap up, I was also saying, if I'm generous with information, that's almost immediately some kind of panic arising inside of me.
Okay,
thinking,
so this the perfect example. So because these companies aren't generous, there's these other kind of Google aggregator sites that scrape their sites to make it easier to find it. So by not being generous, you've created a market, an incentive for aggregators to be a search engine to look at your inventory, cross-reference against your other competitors' inventory. You with me so far? Okay. So then what have they done? When I go to that place, they go through a whole 45-second "are you a human" process. Like I Googled for a part. It landed me at one such company where I could buy it. I went and it's like checking to see if your computer is secure. And I thought it was it looked like kind of like a hack web page. Like their logo was barely on it. I was like, what is this? Checking for security, blah, 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 enter your robot. And I'm like, for you to let me buy something, you're implying that trust isn't there, but you did it to block the aggregator because you didn't give me the information the first go around. It's lunacy. That is the mental, well, we need to hide it even more. So let's take our buyers and create more friction for them. I was so shocked. What are you hiding? What are the world? You think Amazon's no, I'm not going to tell you the price to buy this, product. It's laughable. And I think that, so Steve and I know this, these companies are dying because of this mentality at scale. It's a tough business, and sorry, but you picked it 50 years ago when you entered it, but you're going the wrong way. And they don't spend money on marketing anymore. They're just sort of like a glorified warehouse, and they're doing it more poorly, every day. So I would love to see a new one of these companies come along the southwest of this space and just have it all figured out. They could start small, and I bet you it would take a lot of capital, but I bet you they would do extremely well in this current moment when a lot of these companies are hurting from the post-COVID snapback problem that Steve was mentioning. Yeah.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Carrie. It's always a pleasure. I really appreciate your time, and look forward to further conversations with you. By the way, happy holidays. If we don't get to talk before then, enjoy yourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
For our attendees, your next session is going to start shortly. You can join by visiting the lobby and clicking the join button, or by navigating to the main stage sessions tab. We look forward to seeing you soon. Again, Steve and Carrie, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Balaji.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.